the chilling weight of silence. It arrives without warning, without ceremony. One moment the world is alive with noise, the roar of voices, the swell of applause, the rhythm of movement, and then, as if struck by some unseen force, everything stops. A crowd that only seconds ago seemed unstoppable, invincible in its energy, falls into stillness. We've all felt it before, the stadium that suddenly hushes as one decisive moment unfolds, the courtroom that falls silent after a verdict, the classroom where a teacher's question lingers unanswered, the silence that seems to stretch far beyond seconds, pressing down with a weight that is hard to explain, yet impossible to ignore. Why does this happen? Why does silence, when shared among many, feel so much heavier than when it exists alone? Because silence is not simply the absence of sound. It is a presence in itself, a force that carries weight, meaning, and danger. In silence, illusions collapse. In silence, truths emerge. In silence, power shifts, and it is precisely for this reason that silence terrifies crowds. A crowd thrives on noise. Noise binds it together. Chants, applause, shouts, laughter. These are the rhythms of collective energy, the lifeblood of mass psychology. Noise tells us what to feel, who we are aligned with, and where we belong. But when that noise disappears, when the voices fade, something unsettling begins to take shape. Individuals begin to reappear within the mass. Thoughts, once drowned out, resurface. And in that moment, the unity of the crowd begins to fracture. This is the secret that leaders, rulers, and manipulators of crowds have always known. Noise maintains control, but silence threatens it. A silent crowd is unpredictable. It resists suggestion, propaganda, and even fear. It becomes harder to direct, harder to manipulate. And it is in this fragile, uncertain stillness that true power begins to shift. Silence is rebellion without words, judgment without speeches, danger without motion. It is the one form of resistance that cannot easily be countered because it says nothing, and in saying nothing, it says everything. Over the course of this exploration, we will descend deeper into the strange, unsettling relationship between silence and crowds. We will uncover why silence disturbs us psychologically, why it has terrified rulers throughout history, why philosophers and spiritual traditions both revere and fear it, and why in the modern age, surrounded by constant noise, silence has become rarer, more radical, and more threatening than ever before. Because silence is not empty, silence is alive, and when it enters a crowd, it has the power to change everything. Historical moments of terrifying silence. Throughout history, silence has unsettled leaders, terrified oppressors, and altered the course of human events. At first glance, silence might seem passive, harmless, even weak, yet time and again history has revealed its darker, more disruptive side. Silence as a force of resistance, a weapon, and at times a death sentence. Consider the Nuremberg rallies of Nazi Germany. These events were designed as a spectacle of sound, chants, marching boots, orchestrated roars of loyalty echoing in perfect unison. The noise was not incidental, it was essential. For Hitler and his propagandists, noise was proof of control, proof of devotion. But what terrified them most was not opposition shouted from the crowd. It was the possibility of silence. A quiet stadium would have meant doubt, dissent, collapse. Silence would have signaled that the hypnotic spell of noise had broken, that the collective trance had ended. For authoritarian leaders, Silence is not emptiness, it is betrayal. In Stalin's Soviet Union, silence could be fatal. One infamous story recounts how audiences at political gatherings were forced to applaud endlessly, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours, too afraid to be the first to stop. Because the first to fall silent was often marked as disloyal and taken away. Here, silence was not liberation but terror, weaponized by a regime that demanded endless sound as proof of submission. To be silent was to risk death. And yet silence has also been a tool of defiance. During the civil rights movement in the United States, silent sit-ins disrupted the noisy machinery of segregation. Protesters, often young students, would take their seats at whites-only lunch counters and remain there in silence. No shouts, no violence, only quiet resistance. That silence carried more power than any shouted slogan because it revealed the absurdity and cruelty of the system itself. Silence forced the world to look, and in looking, to confront injustice. In 1989, silence met the tanks in Tiananmen Square. Thousands of students, unarmed and unshouting, stood in defiance. The image of one man standing silently before a line of armored vehicles became one of the most haunting symbols of the 20th century. The silence of those moments carried more weight than words ever could. And even in moments of collective mourning, silence unsettles those in power. After tragedies, societies gather to observe moments of silence. These rituals may appear ceremonial, but they are also dangerous. For a brief time, noise stops. Distraction falls away, and people are united not by propaganda but by reflection. Silence allows them to think, to grieve, to question, and in those fleeting moments, power loses its grip. History teaches us this. Silence is never neutral. It is either enforced as a tool of fear or embraced as a weapon of defiance. And in both cases, it terrifies those who depend on control. The psychology of silence, why it feels unsettling. Silence has always carried psychological weight. To understand why it terrifies crowds, we first have to understand why it unsettles the individual. Why do moments of silence make our skin crawl, our hearts race, our thoughts spiral? Psychologists suggest that silence disrupts our expectations of social life. We are creatures of constant communication. Every pause, every gesture, every sound signals meaning. When that flow is interrupted, especially in the presence of others, we feel a kind of cognitive dissonance. Something is missing, something we expect to be there, and in its absence, tension rises. This is why silence in conversation feels heavier than silence in solitude. Alone, silence can be peaceful, but in a room of people, silence magnifies insecurity. It forces us to wonder, what are they thinking? What are they not saying? What does this silence mean about me? Silence acts as a mirror. It reflects back our own anxieties, amplifies our self-awareness, and projects it onto others. That uneasy silence in a classroom when a teacher asks a question, it's not just the absence of an answer. It's the collective fear of judgment, the vulnerability of exposure. Crowds, too, thrive on noise to avoid this confrontation. Chants, laughter, applause, even arguments, all of it creates a rhythm that tells individuals what to think and feel. The noise acts as social glue, binding people into one identity. But when the noise disappears, that glue dissolves. People are thrown back into themselves. Their individuality, which was drowned out by collective sound, comes rushing back, and with it comes doubt. Research shows that silence makes people uncomfortable because it heightens uncertainty. We are wired to fear the unknown, and silence in a group setting is the perfect embodiment of uncertainty. We do not know what will happen next. We do not know what others are thinking. The unpredictability of silence makes it feel dangerous, but perhaps the most terrifying aspect of silence is its connection to awareness. Noise distracts us. It fills the air, giving us something to hold on to escape into. Silence removes that escape. In silence, thoughts that we try to bury, questions about meaning, mortality, identity, rise to the surface. Alone, this is unsettling. In a crowd, it is explosive, because when silence forces not one, but thousands of people to reflect at the same time, illusions collapse. The collective dream of the crowd begins to fracture. This is why silence terrifies us. It forces us to see ourselves more clearly, and it forces crowds to awaken from the trance of noise. Silence versus noise, the tools of power and control. If silence unsettles us, then noise comforts us. And those who understand power have always understood this simple truth. Noise controls the masses, while silence threatens control itself. Noise is not just sound, it is distraction, stimulation, and saturation. It is the endless rhythm of voices, slogans, screens, and songs that keep societies in motion. Rulers, governments, and corporations alike rely on it, because the moment silence descends, people begin to think, and thinking is dangerous. The Roman Empire perfected this strategy under the principle of bread and circuses. Citizens were kept entertained with constant spectacles, gladiatorial games, festivals, and feasts. The empire understood something profound. People who are distracted by noise rarely revolt. Keep them fed, keep them entertained, and silence will never creep in. Authoritarian regimes took this principle further. Propaganda, rallies, and orchestrated chants were not just displays of loyalty, they were weapons of noise. Chants unite the crowd and drown out individual thought. Applause, repeated slogans, and orchestrated songs create a wall of sound where no silence, and therefore no dissent, can survive. In the modern age, the strategy has not changed. It has only grown more sophisticated. Today's noise comes not from marching boots or political rallies, but from television screens, advertisements, and the endless scroll of social media. Notifications, news cycles, outrage, entertainment, all of it creates a constant hum of distraction. Silence has become rare, even unnatural, and that is not by accident. Noise keeps us compliant. It fills the gaps where questions might arise. Why is the world this way? Who benefits from our distraction? What power hides behind the noise? These are questions silence invites us to ask, and precisely the questions that those in power fear most. This is why governments and corporations fear silence, both literally and figuratively. A silent protest is more dangerous than a shouting crowd. A silent boycott is more powerful than angry words. A silent refusal to participate in the noise of distraction threatens the very structure of control. Silence resists manipulation because it cannot be redirected. It does not give leaders slogans to twist or words to weaponize. Noise is predictable, silence is not. This is the paradox of control. Rulers depend on noise, yet noise is fragile, because the more we are drowned in sound, the more silence itself grows in strength. When silence finally does arrive, it cuts through the noise like a blade, stripping away the illusions we have been fed, exposing the truth beneath. Noise is the weapon of power, but silence is the weapon of freedom. The philosophy of silence. from ancient wisdom to existential dread. Long before psychologists studied human behavior, long before modern states learned to weaponize noise, silence was already understood as something profound, unsettling, and sacred. Across cultures and centuries, silence has been both revered as a gateway to wisdom and feared as a confrontation with the void. In ancient China, Taoist philosophy spoke of the power of silence and stillness. The Tao itself, the underlying order of the universe, was said to be beyond words. Those who know, the Tao Te Ching tells us, do not speak. Silence was not emptiness but fullness, the presence of a deeper truth that language could never capture. Buddhist traditions carried this further. Silence was a tool of awakening, a practice of mindfulness that stripped away the illusions of self. Monks sat in silent meditation, not to escape the world, but to see it more clearly. In silence, the mind's endless chatter faded, and with it, the false constructions of identity. What remained was direct awareness of existence itself. In Christian mysticism, silence was revered as the highest form of prayer. Beyond chants, hymns, or words of scripture lay what mystics called the cloud of unknowing, a silence that opened the soul to the divine. To seek God was not to speak endlessly of Him, but to fall into silence before Him. Yet silence was never only holy, it was also terrifying. Existentialist philosophers saw in silence something far more unsettling, the confrontation with nothingness itself. Kierkegaard warned that silence could reveal the dread of freedom, the overwhelming realization that we are responsible for our own existence, that no external noise can rescue us from the weight of choice. Heidegger described silence as the condition in which we are forced to encounter being itself, stripped of distraction, faced with the raw question of existence. Sartre saw silence as the collapse of all external meaning, where the individual stares into the abyss of radical freedom, and with it, radical responsibility. Silence, in this view, is not just peaceful emptiness. It is exposure, the peeling away of illusions, the stripping down of life to its most essential and terrifying truths. For many, this is unbearable. This is why we cling to noise, because in noise we find escape, we find comfort in distraction, in the borrowed meanings of the crowd, in the reassuring rhythm of endless sound. But to philosophers and mystics alike, silence remains the crucible of authenticity. It is where illusions die and truth is born. To enter silence is to risk everything, to lose the identities, the narratives, the distractions that shield us. Yet it is also to find the possibility of something more real than noise could ever provide. Silence, then, is both our greatest fear and our greatest chance at freedom. It terrifies us because it reveals too much, but it liberates us because it reveals precisely what noise tries to hide. Modern silence, why we fear it more than ever. If silence has always been unsettling, in our age it has become almost unbearable. In the past, silence was unavoidable. The long pauses of rural nights, the stillness of fields, the hush of life before industrial and digital noise. But today, silence has been hunted nearly to extinction. Step into any public space, a bus, an airport, a coffee shop, and watch what happens in moments that once carried silence. People reach for their phones, they fill the void with music, podcasts, scrolling, notifications. The elevator ride that once forced a small, awkward silence among strangers has now been colonized by glowing screens and digital chatter. We avoid silence instinctively, as if it was something toxic, and perhaps it is, or at least we have trained ourselves to believe so. The more saturated our lives become with sound and distraction, the less able we are to endure its absence. The moment the noise fades, we feel naked, alone with ourselves, alone with our thoughts. In this sense, silence has grown more terrifying than ever before. Technology has not just filled silence, it has weaponized our fear of it. Social media thrives on noise, the endless outrage cycles, the constant demand to comment, to respond, to post. In this ecosystem, silence is punished. To be silent is to risk invisibility, to risk irrelevance, even to risk accusation. If you're not speaking, not posting, not reacting, then perhaps you are complicit, perhaps you are on the wrong side. In the digital crowd, silence is no longer simply absence. It is suspicion, but the deeper reason we fear silence is that it shatters the fragile illusions we have built to keep our world coherent. In noise, we find a story, a constant stream of messages, identities, opinions, and entertainments that tell us who we are and what we should care about. In silence, those stories collapse, the scroll stops, the voices fade, and suddenly we are confronted with the question that noise was designed to conceal. What is actually real? Imagine for a moment what it would mean for a crowd today to fall silent, not in distraction, not in awkwardness, but in defiance. In an age of constant stimulation, a silent crowd would be more radical, more dangerous than a shouting one, because silence is now the one thing that cannot be absorbed, monetized, or controlled. It resists the algorithms, it resists the narrative, it resists the endless hum of noise that keeps society spinning, and that is why silence terrifies us more now than ever, because to embrace silence in the modern age is to step outside the machinery of distraction, and in doing so, to reclaim something dangerously powerful, the ability to think freely. Closing message: the courage of silence. Silence is never just the absence of sound. It is the presence of something deeper, something that cannot be controlled, packaged, or fully understood. And that is why it terrifies crowds, rulers, and even ourselves. We have seen how history reveals silence as both a weapon and a threat. We have seen how psychology teaches us that silence unsettles because it forces us to face ourselves and each other without distraction. We have seen how power structures deploy endless noise to smother silence, fearing its unpredictability. And we have seen how philosophy reminds us that silence is both terrifying and sacred, the space where illusions collapse and truth, however uncomfortable, emerges. But in this age of endless stimulation, silence has become more than a challenge. It has become an act of courage. To be silent today is to resist the endless flood of distraction that demands our attention, to resist the pressure to always have a response, an opinion, a performance of ourselves, to resist the noise that keeps us from thinking, questioning, and reflecting. The courage of silence lies in its refusal to play the game of noise. It does not shout to be heard. It does not argue to be right. It simply withdraws, and in doing so, it unsettles everything around it. Silence unsettles leaders who thrive on cheers, unsettles corporations who thrive on clicks, unsettles crowds who thrive on noise to confirm their belonging. And yet silence is not only rebellion, it is also renewal. It gives us the space to step outside the illusions of noise, to breathe, to reflect, and to recognize truths that are invisible in constant distraction. Silence connects us with ourselves, and when shared collectively, It can connect us with each other in ways noise never could. Perhaps the future will not be won by those who shout the loudest, but by those who dare to be silent together. Perhaps the most radical act is not to scream louder into the void, but to step away from the void entirely, to embrace the stillness that noise was built to keep us from facing. And so the question remains, will we continue to fear silence, or will we begin to reclaim it? Because silence, when embraced, is no longer weakness. It is strength. It is awareness. It is freedom. And when a crowd falls silent, not in fear, but in power, the world itself begins to change.